Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman. We're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. One of my students was asking me about break moves. He wanted to know, why are some break moves so good and other break moves are just eh? And I said, all right, let's take a look at some break moves and we'll use a couple criterion to judge them. We'll use how it affects the pawn structure if the pawns get traded and how it affects the activity of the pieces. So let's get going. Let's start with our famous pawn break, the Queen's Gambit. D4, D5. All right, so the break moves here are E4, the Black D-Mar Gambit, and C4, the Queen's Gambit. And for Black, his break moves are going to be E5 and C5. If you don't understand this, you might want to go back to my previous video on what a break move is, because today we're going to assume you not have seen the video, but at least you know what a break move is. All right, so those are the break moves. Let's take all those lines off the board. And let's ask if C4 is a good move. Okay, well, C4 is a break move. That means it's attacking a fixed pawn with a pawn that can't easily go past. That is, the black pawn can't go right past here because it's blocked by the white pawn. And is this a good break move? Well, let's see what would happen if those pawns get traded. There's two ways to trade them. Either white could take or black could take. Neither side has to do that, but either side could do that. So let's see what happens. Let's say black plays Queen's Gambit declined, and white simply plays E3, not the most common move. And we're just doing that to trade the pawns. So the question is, who is this good for? Well, if this is what's happening, and we're not going to talk about the tempo that white gets for the bishop, because maybe black could have delayed it a little till the bishop move. We're just talking about the pawn structure right now. And what's happening is white has traded a C pawn for a D pawn, which means white now has two central pawns, and black only has one. And not only that, white has the space advantage with a pawn on the 4th rank against a pawn on the 6th rank. So this move would be good if black takes. What if black doesn't take? Suppose eventually white takes, and we get the famous Carlsbad formation. Well, that would open up this bishop, but it would also have the effect of trading the C pawn for the E pawn. So again, white has more central pawns. White has two central pawns. Black only has one. And white doesn't have to take, of course. If he doesn't want to, he can always leave the pawn on C4. So we're seeing in general here that this is getting to be pretty beneficial for white because he's threatening to trade side pawns for center pawns, and also he's opening up lines. For instance, if he wants to get his rook into the game, he might play a line like the main line of the Queen's Gambit here, where white simply starts putting things on the C file like here, with the idea that eventually he's going to put some pressure by taking that pawn and opening things up. And he's not unhappy if black takes him first, because now he still has a semi-open file here. So this, by playing C4, he's guaranteeing that he's going to get some play. Now, does black get something for that? Sure, black gets a semi-open file as well on the D file in the central area, but he has less central pawns. All right, now what should we compare this to? Let's see how good that is. Let's turn on the engine, and here he's not going to use the engine. He's going to use the cloud. And the cloud says he's looked 44 ply deep. And if we go back before C4 and we look at white's top 3 moves in this position, C4 is number 1 at 0.3 at depth 44. Knight F3 is at number 2 at 0.2, which allows you to play C4 on the next move. And then if you don't play it at all and play E3, that's down to even 0.0. So we can see this break move is very beneficial. Now let's compare this to a cousin of his, which is the C4 variation of the French defense. All right, so, exchange French. So we're going to play French, and then we're going to do the exchange variation. And now we're going to play the C4 line. Let's turn off the engine for a moment. C4, is this just as good as it was in the Queen's Gambit? Well, it looks like it's just as good because you're playing C4, you're trying to break up that fixed pawn, you're opening up lines, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but not really, because in the Queen's Gambit, this bishop had a pawn on e2 that was blocking it, And now both bishops have tremendous scope. They don't need to open any lines. But what about the rooks? Well, here the e-file is already open. So if both sides castle kingside, like in the old main variation here, then the rooks have some nice places to go on the e-file. And they don't need to break open any lines. They've already got lines that are open for them. But what about the pawn structure? That's what we're really interested in here after pawn takes, pawn takes. And here is a big difference. Without the e-pawns, when white pushes the c-pawn and these two pawns get traded at some point, let's say black waits till white moves the bishop and takes. But now white has an isolated d-pawn. Well, yes, there's a lot of openings where white has the IQP, isolated queen pawn, and they're not all bad for white, but on the other hand, getting an isolated pawn in the central semi-open file like that isn't exactly a benefit. So there's a big difference between playing that c4 break move when you've got the e-pawn to guard the d-pawn and when you don't. So here, not only does this not help white's pieces as much because he already had open files for his rooks, he already had open diagonals for his bishop, so it's not really opening things as much as it does in the Queen's Gambit. But also, he's getting an isolated pawn out of the bargain, and, that's not so good. So c4, even though it is a line in the exchange French, let's see what the computer says. Mr. Computer, in this position in the exchange French, what's your database say here? Let's turn them on. All right, so again, we're at 45 ply, meaning somebody has analyzed this overnight and then sent it up to the cloud. We're seeing that white's top three moves are knight f3, bishop d3, and even the strange move h3. Well, the fact that h3 is considered a better move than c4 tells you all you need to know about c4, which is, even though it's a line here and it's not a terrible move, it's not nearly the really good benefit that it is in the Queen's Gambit. All right, let's take a look at some other break moves. Let's look at one of the most helpful break moves there is in chess, which is the break moves in the French and the King's Indian when the center gets completely fixed. By the way, there's a difference between closed and fixed. Closed means there's no open or semi-open files. Fixed means a bunch of pawns are up against the other pawns of the other color, and you need moves to break open the position on the side of them to get through. Well, here, it's not only closed, there's still no open or semi-open files, and there is not at the start of the game. The start of the game is closed as well, but this is closed and fixed. And also there's a difference between flexible and not flexible. When the pawns get fixed like this, they become inflexible. At the start of the game, we have a closed position, but it could become an open position, it could become a closed position, it could become a locked position. It's very, very flexible. So it's closed, but it's very flexible. Things could happen. So let's go back to our buddy the French here. And let's say white plays e5, which is not the number one move by grandmasters, but it's not a bad move. But a lot of beginners play it because they think they're going to gain space. And now black needs to counterattack. He needs to break open that pawn chain. He needs to get some space for his pieces. And the pointing rule, which is another video that I have here on the channel, says that black should attack on the queen side and break on the queen side. And he wants to break at the base of a pawn chain. The base of the pawn chain makes the pawn chain much weaker. It's like the difference between chopping down a tree at the bottom of the tree, where the whole tree falls over, and chopping down a tree at the top, where only the top falls over. Here, if you chop at the base, if the base falls, then that makes the top much weaker here. So black plays c5, and white usually plays c3 to maintain his chain. But this pawn break, c5, is absolutely necessary. Why? Because if black attacks like with a knight instead of a pawn, and white guards with a pawn, black could keep attacking, and white could even take his queen off of this pawn. Let's say he plays, I don't know, queen f3, and black plays here. White doesn't have to worry about this pawn. He can ignore it, because even though he only has one defender and there's two attackers, black could attack it with a million pieces, and it doesn't help black, because one pawn guarding the pawn would mean any piece that takes it would have to give up a piece for two pawns, and that's not a good trade unless there's something special happening on the board. So once he guards it with that one pawn, then, black's not going to be able to do anything here. He's going to get a very cramped position. So he absolutely needs that break move so that when white starts to guard it with one pawn and black continues to attack it, the number of attackers and defenders would matter, because now we got a pawn attacking and a pawn defending, which is 1-on-1, and now when black starts piling up, it'll mean something because he's got a pawn on it. So c5 is absolutely necessary there. Now let's look. We've already seen in the French defense in the exchange variation that c4 break move for white is okay, but it's not all that strong as if it is in the Queen's Gambit. Let's look at another variation of the French. We've looked at the advanced French. We've looked at the exchange French. Let's look at the Rubinstein French, where white plays knight c3, pawn takes, knight takes. Let's say black plays knight d7, knight f3, knight here, knight takes, knight takes. Turn off the engine here. Mr. Engine, go away. Bishop d3. All right, so black could just play bishop e7 and castle. But the question is, does he have a break move? Well, the two break moves against the center pawn is, why would pawns attacking that pawn be a break move? Because if a pawn attacks that pawn, the white pawn can't just go forward because it's attacked too many times. Well, the two break moves are e5 and c5. Let's take the lines off the board. But e5 is hard to achieve. White's got 1, 2 pieces on it, and black has 0. So it's not going to be that easy. But c5 is very easy. Attacking the center pawn with a side pawn. And now black has 1 defender to 1 attacker on the c5 square, so it's safe. But the question is, how good is this move c5? Well, let's take a look. Right now, if black doesn't do that, let's say black plays bishop e7, castle, castle. Who's better here? Well, look at the space. Right here, there's this no man land line of demarcation here in the 5th rank. But that means white's pieces have 4 ranks behind that neutral zone, and black's pieces only have 3 ranks behind the neutral zone. So white has a space advantage here, and you could see that in the center pawns. White has a pawn on d4, black has a pawn on e6, so white's got more space if black doesn't do anything. Let's go back then. Instead of bishop e7, let's say black plays c5 instead. Okay, well, there's 2 things that could happen here. White could just keep guarding this pawn, in which case black will have a chance to take him and trade a side pawn for the center pawn, or white could initiate the trade. So white could guard the pawn with a move like c3, or he could take the pawn. Well, let's look at both of those. Let's say he takes the pawn. If you want, you can wait till the bishop moves. So let's say white plays, castle. And now black can't play pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, queen takes knight. Why? First problem in the 7th chapter of the Bain book, bishop checks would win the unguarded queen. So the pawn is safe. Let's say black just plays, let's say black plays bishop e7, and now white takes the pawn, so the pawns get traded. All right, in this position, we still have equal pawns, but now black has a nice, healthy 4-on-3 kingside pawn majority, and white has a nice, healthy 3-on-2 queenside pawn majority. Both sides have healthy pawn majorities. The overall material is equal. Black, though, has the only central pawn on the board, this e-pawn, which later on he can try to push up since there's no pawn on d4 to make it difficult. So black's doing okay here with this trade. Now white doesn't have that line of demarcation on the 5th rank. He doesn't have the space advantage that he had before. That pawn on d4 is now gone. On the other hand, suppose white plays c3 and black takes. Well, if white takes with the knight, then we have the same pawn structure we just talked about, where black has the 4-on-3 king. We draw a line down the d file. On the right side, black's got a 4-on-3 kingside majority. On the left, white has a 3-on-2 queenside majority. Equal majorities. Black has the extra central pawn. But let's say white takes. Now we have the famous IQP position, isolated queen pawn. White retains the advantage of the line of demarcation here, preventing the break move on e5. He's got more space. That pawn on e6 is kind of stuck. Why is this okay for black? Because now white's got an isolated pawn on a semi-open file in the center of the board, and black can not only put his pieces in front of that pawn, and they're pretty much invulnerable, but he could also pile up on that pawn in the endgame. If white would trade off all the minor pieces here and get into a queen and 2 rook against queen and 2 rook endgame, this would be a very difficult endgame for black for white, with black attacking the d4 pawn. But with all these minor pieces on the board and the extra space for white, then white's okay. Let's ask the engine to evaluate this position. Engine says if white didn't castle first, then this is not good for him, that black's actually ahead by 3/10 of a pawn. We could go back a move and castle first. Castle. And let's say he plays bishop e7, c3, and now pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Now white doesn't have the problem of castling. And the engine says if black can get to this position, he's got equality. Right now he's got it at 0.0. Okay, so this was okay for black. All right, so that's okay, but we already said what happens in that line. Whoops, we don't want that line. We want the other French line. We want the French line with knight c3, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, where we get to this kind of position. And now on c5, let's say white takes the pawn because he doesn't want the isolated pawn. And now we can see white's advantage is pretty much a normal opening advantage, about 0.2, even though he helped that bishop develop. So what would happen to black if he doesn't play that c5 move? Well, let's go back a couple moves. We already said if he just plays bishop e7 and white castles and black castles, and black never plays c5, let's say he plays bishop to d7. Well, let's see, black just castle, we have to make it white's move. Engine says white should play knight e5. Let's say we don't. Let's say we play queen e2 and black just plays bishop here to come out, where he's not attacking the center with the pawns. The engine now says that white has an advantage of about 1.0. That's a giant advantage, almost close to winning already, because black didn't challenge the center. What does this tell us? It tells us that in this position, c5 is a really good idea. And in fact, let's turn on the engine now. Now we don't even need the engine. It's on the cloud, meaning somebody has done this before and uploaded it to the cloud. In this position, you can see that c5 is now the #1 move. That black breaking open the center with c5 is a really good idea. Does he have other ideas, like delaying c5 for a few moves? Sure, he could play b6 first, defeating kind of the queen bishop, get him out of the way of that e-pawn. He could play bishop e7 and castle and then go for that kind of stuff. But the point is that at some point he wants to break up that pawn, and playing c5 here is pretty good. All right, so let's go back and look at what we've learned so far. We've learned that if there's no open lines at all on the board, if you're making a move like this and he takes and eventually you get the pawn back, we'll just make some silly moves here, that this is pretty good for white. He's got 2 center pawns to 1. All right, we've seen that if he isolates his pawns, then it's not quite so good. For instance, in the exchange French, now playing c4 is not one of the top 3 moves. It's not a terrible move, doesn't lose anything. And, you know, it is a line in the French, but it's not one of the computer's top moves here. Let's look at this in the endgame. Let's say we clear out the board. Let me stop the lesson so I can do that. Okay, so we've set a position in the endgame. And here, it's white to play, and let's turn off the engine again. White would love to get this break move in d4, sorry. Let's say for the sake of argument that black moves his king back. Let's say white triangulates and does something like this. Then if white plays pawn here, where you might say, but that's going to isolate his pawn, and before he didn't have an isolated pawn. Yes, but what he had was even worse. He had a backward pawn, and now if black takes and white takes, both sides have passed pawns. Both sides can easily stop the other side's passed pawn. Dead draw. If white doesn't do something like that, then this kind of break move can be really bad. Now in this position, black has cleverly moved his king up to c5 to try to stop the break move. But what can white do? If he pushes the pawn, he's going to just lose it. Let's say he moves the king over here. Well, black can just bring his king up. And when the king comes back, black can push this pawn White goes here. Black pushes the pawn. Mr. Stockfish, is this a win for black? Engine says, you bet. Seek king here. You could play king e3, or you could just check him. If he keeps going away, you're going to keep pushing the pawn until he takes it. If he takes it, you just take. He kind of waits. You take. He tries to get in front. Here, 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 win. And black's winning. So if we go back to the initial position, believe it or not, the only move that draws for white, and now I turn on the engine so you can see, is to actually sacrifice this pawn, play your break move, black takes, white goes here, and now black says, aha, but I have 2 passed pawns and you only have 1. What if I push this pawn? And white says, well, then I'll push my pawn. And black says, well, I could keep pushing the pawn. And white says, all right, but if you let me go, I'm going to get a queen first. If black keeps pushing the pawn and white pushes and black pushes, white will say, oh, I'll stop your pawn, but you can't stop mine. And now white's winning, so he can't do that. So after pawn takes, king here, pawn here, king here, pawn here, black would have to take. White takes, black goes over here, white goes here. Did you see my video, king and pawn against king? If you have a pawn and your king's not in front of the pawn and your opponent follows 2 rules, he can always draw. The first rule is don't let the king in front of the pawn. The second rule is when the pawn gets to the 6th rank, always go straight back in front of the pawn. Here we can't let black's king come up, so we have to play here to guard both these squares. At some point, black has to push the pawn. Now any of these 3 moves will draw. Let's say we go here. He goes up, we play here. Now if he pushes the pawn, now we have 4 moves, but only one of them draw. We have to go straight back. Comes up, king here, pawn check, king here. Stalemate, or give me the pawn. It's your choice. Okay, so if we go back to the start, it turns out, ironically, that losing the pawn and playing your break move is the only way to draw. If you just sit there with your weakness and try to defend, black's going to use his pawn to deflect you off and then win both these pawns. So you're going to lose. If we started, as I said, in a position where black's king isn't there, like this, and we look at the engine again, it's white to play. You might think maybe he should play king to c4. Well, it turns out king c4 loses just as before. Black's going to play something like b5 check, king here, he's in zugzwang. He comes back. Let's say he goes straight back, king here, pawn push, king here, and then over here, and wins like before. Or if he plays over here, king here, and then check, and eventually he'll get both pawns and he wins. So even in that position where the black king is here, the right move is to get rid of your backward pawn and to get both players having isolated passed pawns, which are completely neutralized. They're equally good and equally bad, and nobody's winning. Both sides can easily stop the other side's pawn, and it's a dead draw. So break moves can be very, very good in the opening, the middle game, the end game. We don't have time in a video to go through every possible middle game position. I just thought I'd show an end game position where that's possible. By the way, one of the questions I asked my student was, of the 3 types of bad pawns, on average, double pawns, isolated pawns, and backward pawns, on the average, which one is generally the worst? It doesn't mean I can't create a position where one's worse than the other. We can always do that. That's what makes chess fun. But the general order would be double pawns are the least weak, isolated are in the middle, and backward pawns are the worst of the 3. Could you create a position where the backward pawn is okay and the isolated pawn's much worse? Of course. That's easy to do. But in general, doubled is the least weak, isolated sort of in the middle, and then backward would be the most back. And you could see it here because if we go back to the original position where white has this backward pawn. Oops, let's take all these lines off the board, Mr. Computer. Oh, he's not going to want to take the lines off the board? Okay, there he goes. In this position, black has had 2 isolated pawns, and white only has a backward pawn, and he has no isolated pawns. And yet it's white who has to sacrifice the pawn and find a way to get a draw here with d4. Now, is that white's only problem, that he has a backward pawn? No, black's king is better than white's king. If kings average 4¼ pawns in fighting value, white's king is only about 3 in this position, and black's is about 5. So there's a strong advantage to black's king in this position over the white king. But we already saw that even if black goes back, if white goes here and black goes back and white comes up, white's still losing even though his king is the one who's further up. So even in this position, having that passed pawn where he has to come over and eventually stop it and let black's king up is still the main thing, and he's got to worry about this pawn here, and now it's too late for white, already not being able to draw anymore. All right, so as I said, opening, middle game, end game, you're always asking yourself, what does this do to the pawn structure? What does it do to the tactics? What does it do to the activity of the pieces? Some pawn breaks are absolutely required and necessary. Other pawn breaks are okay. Some pawn breaks are completely unnecessary. Some pawn breaks are, go so far as to be even bad. But you always have to evaluate and figure out, do I need a pawn break? If I need a pawn break, what should I do about it? Really important stuff. All right, thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, you can, but even more important, you can tell your friends about the channel. We have something on about every kind of level improvement. You can follow me on Twitter where I have my chess tip of the day, Dan Heisman. And you could like the video if you want to as well. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye.